Wake up. This is the History You Forgot, the podcast where three veteran teachers with a combined 90 years worth of teaching experience try to catch you up on the stuff that you probably slept through when you were younger the first time around. Buckle up, because today we're leaving the United States and we're going to France, covering the French Revolution, another in those age of revolutions. So be ready. Here it comes.
My name's Jason Jones. I've been teaching for about 33 years, mostly geography and AP Human Geography lately, but I also have a lot of world history experience.
Yeah, and I'm Jeff Breedlove. I've taught almost 30 years as well, but I have spent most of my time teaching European history with a little world history in there, so I think it's going to be a great episode.
And I'm Jason Schmoida, and I've spent most of my 30 years, in fact, all of my 30 years, teaching U.S. history. So for those of you watching who don't remember much about the French Revolution, I'm kind of on board with you, and we're gonna learn some stuff today. I'm kind of excited about that. If you notice what we have in front of us today, our drink for the week, if you'd like to participate, is a cognac. And for those of you that don't know, cognac is specific to France. Like, the French do this, right? Champagne has to be produced in that region, Bordeaux, things of that nature. Cognac is the same. It's a fortified wine. Back in the 15th century, they wanted something that they could ship out and trade, but they needed something that wouldn't spoil. So everybody was in the search of the perfect fortified wine. So it's basically white wine grapes, and it's distilled twice, and it's oak barrel aged.
Which gives it the color.
Gives it the color, gives it some taste, and I don't know. None of us are really experts on the cognac, but it looks cool, and we're willing to try. So cheers.
To the French Revolution.
To the French Revolution.
Yeah.
There you go. Here we go.
Oh, fortified is, I think, the word of the day.
It's a little hot. It's an acquired taste, I think for sure.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people just have cognac sitting around.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like really smart, cool people.
I think we've got our sophisticated,
which is why the three of us don't have cognac sitting around.
Sophisticated bases, they've got it.
I think so too. We're going to trust
our appeal is like clearly that group, right?
That's right. Well, as we jump into hit this, I'm going to be doing a lot of less talking on this one. So I thought it'd be smart if maybe I set things up and remind you where we've been. We've done the American Revolution, and we've done some early American stuff. So during this time period, remember that the French had come to help us during our revolution. And for us, that's a great story. For the United States, it's a great story. The French come and they rescue us and we win the revolution. For France, it wasn't such a great story. In fact, it just furthered their financial situation, which I know we're going to get into some detail on, but it basically broke them. So while we were having fun celebrating our newfound country, France was in a little bit of trouble. In the United States, what we're seeing a revolution that maybe is because of us, right? Did we inspire another revolution? Our politics of the day were beginning to form, and in a lot of ways, this was the first foreign issue that separated the very beginning of political parties. We'll probably deep dive on this sometime, but Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were having a lot of arguments that really led to the first two political parties. But one of their main elements, really when it came to foreign policy, was do we or do we not support the French Revolution? And Jefferson was a big advocate for supporting the French Revolution. In fact, when we get down to it, Jefferson helps write some of the key components to the written part of all of this, which I think is really interesting. But I thought before I throw it to these guys and let them run with their brilliance, what makes this so hard for Americans to understand? Because to me, this is tricky, right? Like, we've been talking before this. There's just so much I don't remember. I was a 19-year-old kid trying to stay awake in a college classroom.
You were them.
I was, you know what? I slept. The professor, I just remember, a guy with a gray beard that was all brown from the pipe that he smoked. And he stood at the front of the stage and looked at the ceiling, and the chalkboard behind him was full of all this stuff. And I just was frantically trying to keep up. And I don't remember much of it. So I'm really excited for that. But what makes it hard for us as Americans, I think, is a couple of things. There's a very strict class system, stratification of class there. And I don't know that we completely understand that. we had rich and poor, we had social class, but maybe not to the degree that it mattered to the
Right.
French society. So I know we're going to talk about that. This war, another thing, it's hard for me at least. This war's dragged out over time. There are
10 years.
Yeah, there's whole phases to the war, and France is fighting multiple, what'd you say, 6 different countries at some point
Right.
that France is also fighting while they're having their own revolution, and that kind of scrambles the brain a little bit. But it's an enlightenment-based election, or an enlightenment-based revolution, and it makes me wonder, did France do a better job of actually finding those ideals? And maybe that's something that we'll find out as we go along. But you know, I didn't have to learn this multiple times growing up. It's a little bit more tricky for me, but I think if you're in the hands of Breedlove and Jones, we're in good shape. Jason, you were going to kind of start with that social stratification piece, correct?
Yeah, I am. And they called it the estate system. Okay. And I think it's really important you brought up that this is all based on the Enlightenment, right? The American people wanted individual rights. They wanted tax. They didn't want taxation without representation. They wanted a lot of these things. And that's really what the French people are looking for. So the estate system in France was 3-tiered. It had the first estate, which was the clergy. It made up about 1% of the population. The clergy was not taxed. They controlled about 10% of the land in France. And one thing to remember about the church in Europe, really from well before the French Revolution, is that the church was very, very powerful. The church owned land. They could tax you just like your king could. They could imprison you. They could put you to death if you were out speaking against the church, and you were called a heretic. Okay, so the church was super powerful.
Yeah, they were connected to the monarchs almost always.
Always,
right? Yeah.
Always. The second estate was the nobility. Important thing to understand about the nobility is they were powerful because of the land they controlled. The land they controlled went back generations, right? It was given to them by some king well before the current landholder was alive. And so they were a lot of times given government jobs. They were a lot of times given military jobs. They were given jobs of power, but they didn't have huge pocketbooks or checkbooks or bank accounts. You know, if you think about the American Revolution, we talk about people like Washington and Jefferson, Franklin, these guys Adams, who had money. They owned a lot of land, but they also had money. Well, the nobility in France didn't really have a lot of money. They lived a lot better than the peasantry, but they were wealthy because of their bloodline, their status.
So it really was privilege.
It was privilege.
That's
it
a
was
great way to
complete
put it.
privilege.
Yeah.
Unearned privilege, I think, is the connection to the Enlightenment.
And they were only 2% of the population.
Right.
So 3% of the population, we're not even counting the monarch in this yet, right? He's up here somewhere, or she. Right.
The one.
So, yeah, the one. And so then you had the third estate, which was 97% of the people. They were taxed very, very heavily, a lot of times 50% or better. They did not own land. They worked very hard. We're going to talk about bread here later, but bread was 50 to even 80% of their diet. So it was a hugely important piece of this later on in the story. But the third estate had very little power. They were not a part of the government technically, and really it led to a lot of economic issues for the people, for the country.
Yeah, and I think the point that you were making too about the classes and not having money, the third estate was a weird, I think, for America to kind of a concept in the sense that it was, like Jason was saying, everybody else. So you could be from the lowest urban poor to the richest merchant, and you were still in this huge class.
That's a great point because a lot of times the business owners or merchants were wealthier than the nobility, but they had no say in the government
or status or privilege.
So there was a middle class in France, but they were a part of the third estate, which didn't have any say in anything.
Yeah, and I think you can imagine, like, when we get into this, what's going to happen is, which I think is why maybe it's so confusing. You know, the American Revolution, in my brain at least, starts off pretty evenly focused on one thing, right? It's to sever ties with the British.
Yeah.
The French Revolution, depending on your status, your estate, your wealth, your location, you have a different goal in mind, right? So you've got all these different groups, which is why I think it gets so confusing. It gets a mishmash of, dozens of groups of people who all have a different objective.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, you have the first and second estate who, they obviously are probably more in favor of the king than the revolution, but they're obviously willing to take more power if they can get it.
absolutely.
Right.
And if
then,
they're poor nobles, they may side with the third estate because they can get something out of it, as opposed to, I mean, it's gray.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, yeah, you've got that merchant class trying to grab power. You've got the peasants just trying to grab anything.
They got nothing to lose.
They got nothing to lose.
Right.
And so, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of intricacies.
Absolutely.
And people working in different directions.
Right.
It does come across as a little chaotic.
Oh, I think that's a
really
good way to
seems
put
that
it.
way. But ultimately, wouldn't you agree that what binds it all is money?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's kind of behind a lot of this. In fact, some
Yeah.
people would say maybe even more so than the Enlightenment ideas.
Yeah, I think it's, the key to every revolution, right, is almost always economic, right? There's always, like Jason was just saying, that, if you're poor and 50% of your budget is going to your staple diet food, right, it makes it kind of hard to survive, right? So I think that there's that economic turmoil. But, in France in the 1770s, 1780s, there have been bad harvests. There's been bad weather. They're kind of on the verge in some places of, famine, right? The price of food is skyrocketing, right? Inflation is out of control. You've got these people, like Jason was saying, right, who aren't contributing anything necessarily economically to the system, but are getting all the benefits. And here I am, working myself to the bone, and I'm being taxed. So that's the economic issue as well.
Yeah. And the harvest is an interesting thing. If you think about farming practices at the time, right? They weren't rotating crops yet.
Yeah,
they were
early.
They were planting the same crop in the same field, which after 7 or 8 years, you're going to have exhaustion of that soil. Yeah. So you have what they called famine years, right? Where you didn't have a wheat crop to make the bread that 97% of the people, that was 50% of their diet.
Right. Yeah. So I think the economic aspect is always a key, right? There's always this lead up, even with the American Revolution, right? We talked about all the taxes and things. People vote, like we talked about today, with their pocketbooks, right? If we're going to talk about women and stuff, like if you are living hand to mouth and barely surviving, and your husband's unemployed and your kids are starving, and you go to the grocery store and the price of, bread has quadrupled, and yet you don't have any more money in your pocket, inflation is a killer.
Jeff, what was the name of the palace that the
Versailles?
Yeah, Versailles. Yeah. I'm sorry, I was blanking out.
Old man moment.
Well, yeah.
I think that goes into the economics as well, right? I mean, they have a king here, right, who's clearly out of touch financially as well. He's not an economist, right? He doesn't understand. He goes through several finance ministers, right, trying to solve this economic issues. He's living in a palace about 20 miles outside of Paris called Versailles. And all the nobles live there, and he's throwing parties, and it's this lavish lifestyle, and their outfits are out of control. And, he's trying to, use the palace as a way to control his nobility, right? If you're in my house, I can watch you. But the cost of just building it, I mean, if you ever get a picture, we should throw some sort of photo up, right? Like it sort of boggles the mind, right? Especially an American, right? How does someone live like this? How does someone have this at their fingertips? Where's that money coming from? Well, the question is, they're borrowing a lot of money from other nations. And
this is the king that chose to fight with the Americans.
Absolutely.
Who helped bankrupt the country.
Right. So you've got bad harvests, you've got unfair taxation, you've got the American Revolution, you've got Versailles, and he's also fighting a few wars at this time that he's not very good at. So he is in debt. I think at one point, something like on the eve of the revolution, like 50% of the national budget is going to service the debt. I mean, it's one of these kind of, it's the system is doomed to explode.
And for clarification, this is Louis XVI.
And Marie
Louis
Antoinette.
XVI, Marie Antoinette.
Names we may definitely recognize.
Yeah, I think that's why sometimes for Americans it kind of rings a bell, right? Marie Antoinette has clearly been sort of a pop culture figure.
The last king and queen of France.
We got a couple more, don't we? We got like Louis XVIII here. For
you're right. They come back,
which is why the French Revolution,
a little bit after Napoleon.
Yeah, which I think is why the French Revolution.
Why this confused.
I was just going to say, they go through this revolution, and then eventually they're going to end up kind of swinging back a little bit, a couple times. I mean, I always joke that if revolution was an Olympic sport, right, the French would medal every time. They are really quick to sort of rise up, right? And they do this a couple of times in the 19th century, right? There's going to be a few years of this. And this is not, by the way, just FYI, the revolution that is part of Les Mis, right? When people talk about that, this is not that revolution for all you English majors. That would be the 1830 revolution, right? So, yeah, so I think Jason's got a good point, right?
Yeah. So you've got this king that's spending all this money. We've got the debt that's been incurred by the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. And so now you got a king who starts to feel the unrest, right?
Oh, and Mary to a woman everybody hates.
Everybody hates because she's not French, right? She's Austrian. Right. And so now he's got to try to do some things to try to right the ship, if you will, right? And so the Estates General is what they called at the time the legislative body. And the Estates General hadn't met in 175 years. Okay? Which is crazy, right? So if you listen to your teachers when they taught you this stuff, they talked about absolute monarchs, people who are making all the decisions with no support, right? It's their way or the highway. That's what's going on in France.
And he's like the apocryphal. I mean, he's the one, right? No one really does it much better than him.
Yeah. And so he calls the Estates General. Okay, so now you've got your three estates that show up. First estate, clergy. Second estate, nobility. Third estate, the peasants or the everybody else. At the Estates General, the numbers of delegates is different. It's 100, 100, and 300. So the third estate has 300 delegates. The others have 100 delegates. Are my numbers right there? I think that's right.
Whatever the numbers are, it adds up to where the third estate can always be outvoted.
Right,
the first and second. I mean, I think
no matter how many members didn't matter. Yeah, and it really didn't matter how many members were there, because each estate only got one vote.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
right.
And so and they all met in different rooms. So if you wanted to, let's say, change the voting and how the votes were counted, we're going to do it by delegate, right? Let's say, well, they wouldn't debate that together. They would debate that amongst themselves, and then they'd vote. So the third estate is never going to get anything passed. Right. The other thing the king did is he asked them to all bring a book of grievances, a cahier, and that they all bring this book of grievances, which as they sit down together and write them up, it just intensifies the anger and the frustration.
And they're almost all economic.
Yeah.
I mean, right.
And so you've got this Estates General that comes together. There's no communication really between the estates. And they're trying to make decisions to improve the country. And the third estate makes several requests, including the voting, and they're voted down, right? And so their frustration continues to grow. At that point, the first and second estate are kind of tired of listening to the third estate. Okay,
it's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and so they come to the meeting hall. The third estate being they,
and when they're meeting at Versailles,
yes, so that's right,
at the home of the king, right? So I mean, he's there. This is all happening in like a 5-block radius. Right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And they come to their meeting room, and the doors are chained shut, and they can't get into their meeting room. Okay, and the first and second estate are meeting, so they realize at that point we've been basically eliminated from the process. Yeah. And of course, anger, right, by the estate, and they go basically wandering around Versailles looking for a place they can meet, and they find what is called a tennis court. Now, today's tennis, it's probably more of a racquetball court, but they go into this racquetball court. There's several pretty famous pieces of artwork where they're in the racquetball court. There's other delegates looking in from the windows, and they call it the tennis court oath, because they make an oath that they are going to continue to meet until they have a new constitution written. Right. And so now all of a sudden you've got the other estates looking around going, oh, this is getting serious.
This is real.
This is getting serious.
Yeah. I think the key to that, as you're talking about this, right, is that, like Jason just said, I mean, this is all happening, in a few blocks. So the king is aware of it, right? He's getting reports every day. He sees this all, and he's still not necessarily engaged in the process. He calls the Estates General, right, to have them create some sort of new tax policy so it doesn't fall to him, right? Because he doesn't want to get blamed. Let them get blamed, right? So when this is all going down, he begins to kind of panic, I guess, a little bit, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and he wasn't really considered a great leader.
No,
You
good
know,
point.
I mean,
Good point.
So
Yeah,
his
he's not the
leadership skills
sharpest
were not.
tool. Yeah, not the sharpest tool. But he's being advised too, right, by these people who have a lot of vested interest in this, right, by nobles and clergy who see this as a possible loss, right? The king can't give up, and yet he's kind of torn, right? And what ends up happening is the tension sort of leads to this sort of elevation, where the king sort of ends up sort of calling up some troops to kind of keep some order, right? To keep the third estate in place. The third estate declares themselves like the National Assembly of France right now. They get to speak for everybody. So if you're the first and second estate, you're like, wait a minute. And what ends up happening is this sort of then begins to grow, right, in influence outside of Versailles. And Paris is just 15, 20 miles away. The people of Paris, right, are also sort of aware this is going on. And they hear this elevated tensions. The third estate has been locked out. Now we've got this sort of clash. The king has, called up some troops, and there's now more troops around Paris, right? They're seeing this on the street. And, they realize that if this is going to go down, the one thing they're going to need are some weapons, right? So a group of them, a sort of radical group of urban poor, decide to storm what is known as the Bastille, right? It is kind of a prison, but it's really the armory. So it's got all the weapons. I think it turns out at the end of it, there's only like 6 or 7 prisoners actually in there. Yeah. So it's sort of got like this legend to it.
A very small garrison of French troops.
Absolutely, but a lot of guns. So, that the 14th of July, right, when they tear the Bastille down, they arrest the commandant or whatever. And, of course, he gets his head chopped off and put on a pike, which then kind of creates all these visceral images that we think about the French Revolution. And that then becomes sort of the beginning, right? I guess American history, kind of the target date, right, as a start, like the Declaration of Independence.
A little like our shot heard around the world.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Lexington and Concord,
or the Boston Massacre,
Bastille Day. Yeah, it makes sense a lot.
Right. And it's what they celebrate now as their Independence Day, right? Even though it's the beginning of the revolution, at the end, it does become sort of their national point.
And what's cool about that, at least again from my perspective, is it is that mass group of people, that third estate, realizing they have numbers, they can do some things. And you know what? If you shut us out, that just propels us towards action to do something.
Yeah. And I think what you remember too, at this point, we're talking end of the 18th century, even if you are middle class or even working class, chances are you can read, right? You're relatively, you're literate, these ideas. The Enlightenment has sort of trickled down. You're well aware. The Enlightenment we talk about, is kind of centered in France, right? It's a really sort of a French movement. So the people of France are clearly aware of what's going on and very well versed. And, we keep talking about peasants and poor, but you got to remember this third estate is everybody else, right? So it turns violent. There's obviously the Bastille is the beginning of kind of a violent, but, what happens is there sort of becomes this widespread fear then, right? Like Paris is on fire and the Bastille and the people are rising up. And so this moment turns into what's sort of called the Great Fear, right? As it spreads throughout France, and you've got sort of local nobles throughout the country who are, dragged from their beds and then, beat up or God forbid killed, and people in the local region, looting and robbing and trying to go, this is our moment, right? There's no one protecting these people. We're going to finally do this. But, that just leads to this overall sense of chaos that you're talking about right now. Is like the whole country's on fire. And so now you got other countries around them kind of paying attention, like, what's going on? Right? I think
Jeff, it also leads to the women of Paris, right? Pulling Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI out of Versailles and bringing them back to Paris.
Because they were kind of hiding, right? They were kind of away from some of that chaos. Is that correct?
I think the word is they were, willfully removed. Okay. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if you'd necessarily at this point they're hiding. They're just sort of thinking this isn't going to go anywhere. Right. We're outside. We're ground up guards. Everything is going to be fine. It's just a bunch of rabble rousers. Right. But it is clear that it's elevating. And what Jason's referring to is sort of towards the end of this and the beginning of what these phases we'll talk about is the women of Paris. Remember, women are the ones always on the front line of revolution, right? They're always early on, all in, right? They see the prices, they see their husbands, they see their children starving. So they decide to appeal to the queen, right? She's a mother, their mother. She's a wife, their wives, right? She has a contract, typically a social contract, where she's supposed to be typically the mother of France, right? So a few thousand women, like Jason's talking about, typically very low, like, shopkeepers and, fishwives and things like that.
Strong women.
Yeah.
Women who use their hands.
Yeah. I mean, these are,
but maybe not women who had their hairdresser make their hair into a boat.
Right.
That would be a perfect example, right?
Maybe
These are
not
women
quite.
whose, calloused hands and
Yes.
broad shoulders, right? These are women who work for a living and probably might sometimes be the only income if their husband's in the laid off, right? So they march. And they march to Versailles. And along the way, right, the king is like trying to figure this out and like calls up and goes, hey guys, we ought to shut this down. But, you watch a bunch of women marching and they're your mothers, your sisters, your wives. You don't fire on them. And so what happens is over the 15-mile march, they're joined by a lot of the soldiers that were supposed to sort of quell the violence. And when they get then to Versailles, unfortunately, right, they start calling for the king and the queen, right? The baker, they have like a saying, right? They refer to him because all the grain silos and stuff are there, right? They want some help. And a few people clearly are killed, right? Some guards are assassinated. They start calling for the queen. And this is when they begin to panic, right? They hide, they run, she makes a dash in the middle of the night, right, to get away. The crowd does eventually break into Versailles. They trash it. They're looking for her
apartment.
Oh yeah. They're looking, I mean, now that,
her bed.
Yeah, that she doesn't respond to their requests really pisses them off, right? I mean, because now it's clear she doesn't care.
Is this where the quote comes into play? Is this the right time to ask? Did Marie Antoinette really say, let them eat cake? Is this, do I have the right context here?
Yes. Well, you're in the right ball. Yes. You're in the right time of the revolution. Most historians believe she did not say, let them eat cake.
Okay.
I don't know that, to be honest with you, she was aware enough.
Right.
I'm not saying she wasn't smart. She was a smart woman, but I'm not sure she was aware enough of the plight of the people at the time to know to say something like that.
Yeah. You gotta remember she's the daughter, right, of Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria.
They're all related.
They're all, which is a whole separate episode, right? Like we could just draw a big thing on the wall. Yeah. She is raised from birth to be a queen. Yeah. Right. Yep. She doesn't know what you and I would consider normalcy.
And she's good at it.
She's really good at it. I mean, she marries the Dauphin, the future king, at 14, right? And she's ferried into France, and her life is very removed and very privileged. And but like Jason said earlier, right? I mean, she's kind of universally loathed, even though I don't think that's necessarily the right way to look at her. I think she's a woman who is a victim of her time. A lot of people would say that she was vilified because, it's easy to vilify the women, right? I mean, to make the women look bad. So if you don't want to have a reason, they'd make her look like she's the bad one all along. But I don't know if I go that way, but yeah.
Yeah. I think when she first got there, everybody thought she was very beautiful,
right?
Young and beautiful. But she was married to, I heard one historian call it, I don't even know if this is a word, but call Louis XVI the schlub.
Yeah. He's kind of he's kind of
he's just kind of lethargic and doesn't have a great mind for what he's supposed to be doing. And so
they don't have kids right away. So there's question about that. I mean, there's all sorts of history.
I think also there's probably some who believe she's probably calling some of the shots because 100%. He is not a good leader, so.
Yeah.
Well, so we've kind of set up this whole thing and we've gone through what I would call some of these catalysts, these things that pushed us towards the revolution. And so I think what we want to do maybe is, what are the key things we want to know about how this all unfolds? And it has multiple phases, and it is a little, like I said, to many of us, it's a little bit confusing. So we wanted to lay it out in a fairly simple way.
Yeah, there we go.
And the way I see the first stage as being, we talk about it as the moderate phase of the war. But what I see as integral to that is the king, we've talked about his personality, his characteristics. He's got to survive this somehow.
Absolutely.
Right. So I see what's key to this moderate phase is him sort of, I don't know if capitulation is the right word, but he sort of bows down to the National Assembly and says, I will work with you.
Absolutely.
As long as I can stay. And what that creates is, in essence, a new government as a constitutional monarchy. So there is a monarchy. He gets to stay in his position. Now, he's limited quite a bit.
Yeah.
From what I understand, the church is limited quite a bit during this time period. And I think what's interesting about it is it does create this notion of equality.
Yeah.
And there's your Enlightenment ideas and where they began to blossom. Now, the end of this isn't necessarily that, but here's the moment, right? This is the moment where the nobility has been brought down to life just a little bit. The the church has been brought down into its place just a tad. There's a sense of equality. It doesn't quite end that way, though, does it? It doesn't quite end that way.
It actually kind of ends too much that way. I mean, we're going to see. It's
Good.
kind of the Enlightenment gone awry towards
rogue.
the end, but rogue is a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But I think the moderate phase is a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of like ease.
Yeah, and you get the idea that we're going to give the General Assembly more power, and so the people have more power, right? Like Congress in the United States.
You had mentioned earlier.
That's the idea, anyway.
100%.
With that, you'd mentioned the role of the middle class. I mean, that's significant, right?
Absolutely.
Because same in the American Revolution, right? What happened in Boston wasn't the poor; it was the middle class merchants,
people
business
had something
owners.
to lose.
Yeah,
Right. Which is what I think was a great point that Jason was just making, right? If you're giving rights now to this National Assembly, which is going to change its name a couple of times, but that's not necessarily significant, they are educated men of property, right? So their interests are going to be protecting the rights and responsibility and the power of their stuff, that, property, right? And so, revolutions are almost always sort of led by the middle class. They're smart enough. They get it. They're right on the verge of a seat in power. They know how to do it. And to this phase, I mean, to the middle class, to this National Assembly, the revolutions could be over.
Yeah.
I mean, they've got a seat at the table. They're calling the shots. The king has been constitutionalized, if that's a term.
What's interesting about it is that there just still were so many people that were unhappy. And there were so many people not satisfied with this outcome.
Yeah, I think 97% approximately are still unhappy.
Well, yeah, because I think the point has to be that all the economic issues, the inflation, the bread prices, the unfair taxation, have not been fixed.
Right.
So Jeff, if you were a noble, you had knee breeches on, what we might call knickers, right? And as we move out of the moderate phase into the next phase, there's a group that doesn't wear knee breeches, and they were called...
Love the fill in the blanks that you give me, right? Because it's like guaranteed I'm going to get this right.
You're going to get it right.
So they're called the sans-culottes, right? Which are the people without knickers or breeches, right? They wear long pants. They're what we would call working poor.
Yep. They're
laborers or shopkeepers. But again, they know how to read. They're pretty, But I think the thing that sort of shifts the phases, right, is that at the end of this sort of Republican moderate phase is the king makes a really bad decision. And fearing for his life, wanting to get his power back, knowing he's lost control of the army, all this, he takes his family and he flees, right? And there's a couple really significant things about that. One is the fact that, he's abandoned, right, Paris. So that's the first thing. He's running towards the border, right, which is Austrian, I believe, right, at the time. Austria. So it's her brother, Joseph II, who's now Emperor of Austria. So that's collusion, right, in terms of this. But really, it breaks what's known as sort of the social contract, right? You talk about Locke and all these Hobbes. The social contract is that I will obey, but you, in theory, as my monarch, need to care about me, take about me, protect me. Yeah. And all of a sudden, the king's in my darkest moment, right? My country is on fire, and he runs away. So he's caught, right? a few miles from the border.
And so he's treasonous.
Absolutely.
And the funny thing or interesting thing about when he stopped in this small town just before the border is the first night watchman of this town actually kneels to his king.
He's
so there was still a lot of confusion, right? And then the next couple of gentlemen who show up arrest him.
Yeah. I always kind of picture this in my brain, right? I always think about the king and his family, right, are fleeing France. I'm guessing they travel pretty heavy, right? They're not with like a small valise or a backpack, right? And they're, hitting the train. I mean, they've probably, I don't know this for a fact, but my vision is they've got multiple servants and a whole bunch of luggage and a bunch of carriages.
With gold on it.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, it's not going to be too hard to pin them, but
not so.
At that point, right, the king is brought back. He's now sort of put, I believe she's actually put in prison at that point, right? And,
he is.
Yeah. And so he's under arrest now, right? And now the question becomes, right, what happens? And at this point, this group of radicals uses this as a moment to sort of assert power, right? And people have heard the names. We don't need to go in there. Girondin and Jacobin and all these. But in theory, the idea is they want a more...
Robespierre,
all that, right? We're going to get there. But they're a more They want a more enlightened France, right? They want the power to literally be disseminated all the way down. They want absolute equality for everybody. They want no king. They want a full, true republic.
Well, and this is when you, during the radical phase, when people are put to death
using
the guillotine.
Yeah, I mean, what we're going to get there. But I mean, like, yet these people are not going to take no. Right? So, when the king is finally arrested, he is, like Jason said, put on trial for treason, and he is found guilty and he is beheaded, right? So it's a regicide. It's a flaw with absolutism, clearly, because there shouldn't be any way to judge the king, but he's judged. And it begins this sort of rise of this terror as a tool. But what you have to remember is that this radical phase has all this, I guess, enlightened intent, right? They want to sort of make women equal. They want to equal the way taxes are done. They want to get rid of all feudal rights and any aristocratic privileges, and almost been kind of taken care of. Yeah, they want. Oh, absolutely, right. They that's a great way, right? They create what's called the civil constitution of the clergy, and they make, they take away all of that, right? The land, they're going to use it basically to try to fund a new currency,
and pay down the debt, right?
Right, pay down the debt, but it doesn't work, right? So all of this, and because there's so many different factions, it's sort of always shifting, right? And what ends up happening, as Jason just alluded to, is a small group, which is eventually going to change their name again now to the convention or national convention. There's a group of them that they refer to themselves as the Paris Commune. And they are led by, in this case, a young man from the countryside, Robespierre, who is going to then decide that, ironically, the way to end the revolution is to sort of speed up the terror, right? If you execute I know it's awesome. If you execute everybody who's anti-revolution, then the revolution's over, right? I mean, so you create these laws that kind of make a whole bunch of things treasonous. You create a whole class of people who don't now have ability to defend themselves in a court.
You allow people to just show up with lists of people who they've heard speaking positively about the monarch,
right,
or negatively about the revolution, and then those are the next people to be executed.
Right. I mean, there's just sort of chaos, and in the city of Paris, it's sort of centered, but it does spread throughout the countryside. But I think what ends up happening here is that at the end of this sort of chaos, the revolution is 10 years, right? So the irony is that the revolution eventually eats its own young, right? That the people that are most radical at some point, I always liken it to like the McCarthy moment, right? Where in the house where somebody says, do you have no decency, right? People are like, wait a minute, you're now taking all this, you have this list, you're holding us hostage. How do we know? And Robespierre, as long as others, is sort of called out. Right. And he threatens to make a new list. It's an epic, great story, right? He runs across the street when he knows he's going to be arrested. He holds up overnight. They come to arrest him. He pulls a gun. He shoots himself trying to commit suicide. It goes through his jaw so he doesn't die. But God forbid he dies before we put him on trial and execute him, right? So we literally put him on trial right away and then haul him down. And at that point, there's sort of a moment where okay, wait a minute, maybe we can pull this back.
And that's when they kind of go into this rule of the directory.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm not trying to, but think about this. The church, this is those great stories, right? Like Jason said, and you can add to this. They change the names of all the streets, right? They get rid of anything with the word saint in it.
Well, you're an elected official now if you're a cardinal or a bishop or a priest.
Right.
They try to eliminate.
Right. We think that
control the church.
Yeah, the Julian calendar is too Catholic, so we come up with a whole new calendar. We base it on like decades, and so now there's a new year 1, year 2, year 3. Right, we crash that. We get to call each other citizen, citoyen, right? Because Mr. and Mrs. are class based, and that's ancien regime. It just goes off. There's even, I think, the point where what is the festival of supreme being, where
they made almost like a paper mache out, and Robespierre has this white robed group of people, and he's singing, and they're all singing, and this is kind of when a lot of the people of Paris think this guy's gone crazy. Right. I mean, what's going on? But then he's killed. And one other, at least the way I understand it, was he was holed up in an office where they actually wrote a lot of the revolutionary documents, and on the table where he shot himself, they actually placed him on the table where the rights of man and citizen and a lot of these documents were written, right? And he's laying on this table dying, right? Where
But
he
not
was,
before we can
Right.
execute him.
Right. Because
Where-
they guillotine him, right?
They
Yeah,
guillotine.
yeah. No, he does. He gets guillotined.
Guillotine.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
probably minutes or hours before he would have probably bled
Yeah,
out
that's
anyway,
crazy.
right? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? And so now Robespierre's gone. There's not a lot of direction for the
Right.
revolution, and they decide they need to set up a directory. The directory is going to be a 5-man oligarchy, and that's a term we hear today, right? Is oligarchy. And so you've got a 5-man oligarchy. They're the executive branch. You do have an estates general or a general assembly that is your legislature. There's really not a lot of talk, Jeff, that I remember about a judicial branch. I know
I'm sure there is.
there is, but
Right.
they don't really talk about it in these documents.
Right.
It's an interesting way to try to do things. Obviously, it's very hard when you've got 5 people trying to make decisions for everybody. Who's really the leader, right? And it ends up being a very corrupt government.
Yeah.
And so in terms of taxation and a lot of those things that were going on, and they're trying to change for the better for the people. I think the directory was still trying to do that. They just weren't very good at it.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to the way it was before the radical phase, right? I mean, it's a small group of wealthy
Yeah, they give the
men.
rich the power again.
Right. So, I mean, it
regain
goes
power.
back. And so I think that's what really fails. And at this point, and we're going to clearly create another episode of this,
Sure.
you're going to get, a new young man on the scene, right?
Well,
Who's
yeah.
going to come to the rescue of the directory and the convention at one point.
And they
right?
do some positive things. They abolish
They
slavery.
do. They do.
The metric system comes about.
Which I love that, right? Always
Right.
like the
Little-
metric system. Right?
Part 2 of this has to be Napoleon.
It's going to be Napoleon.
It's got to be
Gotta
Napoleon. And I think that's another thing that's always interesting and probably reaches that level of irony where a revolution of the people for the rights of the people turns into an emperor.
Right. It swings back.
It swings right
exactly.
back.
It's a pendulum,
Yeah.
right? And just
It's
how far
super
back does the pendulum go? Well,
Yeah.
we'll get
Yeah.
there. So
we'll get there for sure.
sure. I think at this point, we're going to do the who would you most like
Yeah, I
to
think
have a
that's-
drink with from this whole, and we're going to call on you since,
Well,
let's hear your opinion on this.
so I was desperately looking for someone that didn't have much of a voice, right? And I thought about maybe just like unnamed radical or something like that. But I found a woman because I think it was interesting, like the Women's March that played such a huge role in this. And then there's another woman that I think plays a really interesting role, and her name is Charlotte Corday. And there was I call him bathtub guy. What's it? Marat.
Marat. Yeah.
So he was a revolutionary who had some kind of a weird skin disease, and he sat in a bathtub. And evidently, he would publish letters to inspire the revolution, but he would publish lists of people. And like during that radical phase, a lot of these people were getting executed, and it was almost like he could write the names down, and they would get executed. Charlotte Corday went to him to share her list of names and killed him. And basically was arrested and put to death herself, but said, yeah, I did it because he was bad. He was bad for what we were doing. And I thought, okay, that's all that's ever said about her. I need to give her a cognac and say, okay, talk to me a little bit. Like, why did you do this? Why did you think it was okay to go that far?
Yeah.
And if you had anything to say, because she really didn't get to say much. Like, if you had anything
Probably
other
not.
than I did,
Yeah.
And Marat was, by many Parisians, considered an expert, right? What he published, they believed.
oh, absolutely.
Right. And so, in a lot of ways, she felt like she needed to silence a voice.
That's a good way to put it.
Right.
Yeah. Save the revolution.
So, yeah.
Right. So it'd be a good one. So yeah,
interesting.
Charlotte Corday.
Charlotte Corday.
There's a name that kind of
Cheers-
got pulled
cheers
out of
to
the hat.
her, right?
Cheers to her.
So
Cheers.
I think we've set that up, right? Next
I
time
think
we
we're-
get together,
yeah.
it's time to talk about Napoleon, and it'd be a really interesting period.
Let's do it. We'll do
Absolutely.
Napoleon.
Well, I guess then, guys, it's class dismissed.
There's no doubt.